Do you also feel like banging your head into the wall sometimes? Stay in bed forever? Just cry? Or plainly freak out because the bad news about corona seems to have no end? Well, these are tough times. You switch on the news or look at your favorite website and it's not a pretty picture. More dead every day, infections on the rise. Johns Hopkins now counts more than 1 million cases worldwide. Healthcare systems are reaching their limits. Whole countries in lockdown. Friends and families are cutting off contact with each other. And it doesn't end there. Businesses are facing bankruptcy. Workers are losing their jobs. It's all pretty scary stuff. So how can we get through these challenging times without feeling helpless and depressed? Today we'll talk about how to get on top of that situation that feels very much like nothing is in our own hands. This is DW News with our special coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Gerhard Elfers in Berlin. Welcome. So what coronavirus does to the body is quite well known by now, and more research is underway. But what does it do to our soul? Fear of infection, the isolation, worries about loved ones who are at risk. What can we do to not be overwhelmed by panic? Let's bring in Maren Urner. She's a neuroscientist, and her field of research really is bad news and what it does with our brain. Maren, how does this barrage of bad news that we're seeing right now influence our perception of this pandemic?
Well, first of all, it tilts the perception in a certain direction because, as you already mentioned, most of the news are actually negative. So we get the idea that the world out there is even more negative and even more challenging than it is really. So what that does to our brain is really create a continuous or chronic stress response. So we're continuously in this situation where we think we either have to fight or run, the fight or flight response. And what that does to our perception and also to our decision-making abilities is currently under research. And what we know so far is that it definitely hinders long-term or good decisions that are focusing on long-term plans.
The virus is a threat we cannot see or feel. It's similar to radiation. Does that give the fear another dimension?
Yes, certainly, because, of course, if we see something like a wave coming towards us, we can run. And what we realized also, especially in many countries where the virus wasn't present in the beginning, people were very relaxed about it because it was far away. And something we know about risk perception in humans is that spoken openly is quite bad. So when we don't see something, we actually can't grasp it because our brains are not optimized for that. So it really needs to be local, it needs to be immediate, and it needs to hurt people for us in order to act. And of course that creates really a challenging situation, because then what also comes into effect is what I mentioned before, that it creates this continuous stress response which hinders our problem-solving abilities.
It doesn't really help. Old people are not only more at risk, they are also by default more isolated than younger people, and now even family can't visit. What does that do to the elderly, and how can we help keep their spirits up?
Yeah, well, maybe also saying something more hopeful, because I ended on a very negative note in general, is what it can also create, and also especially to the elderly people, is a sense of community. Because once we all understood that this is really a risk situation and this is really a danger that is out there, even though we can't really feel it or see it, it can create this common sense of shared responsibility. And that's what we see all over the world, and also with regard to the elderly, that people actually take more time, take more care, not only to the people we know and our own family members who might be isolated and feel lonely, but also to strangers, because we now, what we consider psychologically, are in one group. We act together against this virus that is the global threat.
Maren, news outlets are often criticized for focusing on the bad news all the time. Like all journalists we here at DW are guilty as charged. But just reporting on happy pandas and kittens is not really an option either. So what can we, the media, do?
Yeah, I was already kind of hinting at that because that's really a unique chance for what we call constructive or solution-oriented journalism these days. Because now we have this idea or this understanding that we are all in this together, and people all over the world ask, what now? And that's really the key, let's say, additional question that is introduced by constructive and solution-oriented reporting into journalism and into the journalistic thinking. And that's, for example, what lots of journalists are practicing now these days, because the people come towards them and they have this urge to get answers to all their questions and needs to understand the situation. And I see this really all over the world now, and we just need to focus on it even more. The people who select the news they consume, but also, of course, all the journalists that are covering this global pandemic.
We'll try to heed your advice. Maranona there, thank you very much for this input.
Thank you.
But it's not just the news that can give you the blues. We are social creatures, so having to live in self-isolation can be pretty stressful in itself. Our reporter, Kio Dörrer, talked to a researcher who observed quarantined people during the 2003 SARS epidemic.
In 2003, a previously unknown virus caused the severe acute respiratory syndrome known as SARS. More than 8,000 people were infected and thousands were quarantined. Rima Styra conducted research into the mental health of people during their SARS quarantine.
And what we found was that there was a high percentage of people who had both PTSD and depression from having been in quarantine during the SARS episode. So what we found when we talk about PTSD, what we know is that people feel upset, hopeless, depressed, angry, frustrated. They feel there's a lack of control.
How can you basically explain the fact that people get this PTSD or experience depression?
So I think what happens is, post-traumatic stress symptoms, okay? So that's what they're starting to experience, is the fact that it's a traumatic event. And for people, when they were sort of thinking about the fact that they might develop SARS, or in this particular case, coronavirus, you're thinking about, am I going to make it? When am I going to feel the symptoms? Oh, I have a bit of a cough. Oh, I have a little bit harder to breathe. Is this coming on?
Although the current coronavirus pandemic is also throwing up such fears, there are differences now too, and some of these could even have a positive effect on people's mental health.
Now there's more of a sense of community. So what we see now is there's so many people in isolation that people don't feel they're the only ones. There's a lot more communication as well now. We have technologies. The other thing that's happened this time, which is very different from SARS, is that there's a lot of psychological support.
What are the things that people can do if they find themselves now in isolation?
Keep in touch with family and friends by using technology. They will provide you a tremendous amount of support. The other thing is setting out a routine. And routine helps in calming one's fears and anxieties.
Even though the world might seem grim at the moment, we should remember that there are still things we can do for ourselves and for others. Not everything is beyond our control.
And now to a man who has managed to stay in control and stay calm all through this crisis. He's a biologist, a science journalist, and our resident corona expert, DW's Derek Williams, with us again to answer questions that you sent to us.
Since the virus passed from animals to humans, can humans pass it on to livestock?
There isn't much work out there yet looking at which animals could carry the disease or might even get sick from it. One study published by a Chinese team earlier this week claims the virus replicates poorly in a range of domesticated animals, among them dogs, pigs, chickens, and ducks, but that cats and ferrets showed some susceptibility and could also pass it along to each other. That work still has to be confirmed. It's not a surprise, though, if it's correct, because a number of coronaviruses are known to cause a range of illnesses in livestock and poultry.
How long does it take for an infected person to stop being infectious?
It turns out that it's a pretty tricky question to answer, and like so much else, we don't know for sure yet. When it comes to catching any viral disease, the length of time you remain infectious differs depending on the virus, and we aren't sure how long that period is for SARS-CoV-2. However, a study carried out here in Germany indicates very high loads of virus in COVID-19 patients peaked about 4 days after symptoms began and dropped steadily from there. The researchers recommended release, though, only 10 days after symptoms began, and then only if detectable levels of the virus had dropped dramatically.
If the virus attacks the lungs, will this also affect other organs?
It's clear that if your respiratory system is affected by an illness, then it's going to have knock-on effects throughout the body, not least for your heart, of course. But there's also mounting evidence that the coronavirus might directly affect the heart as well, or it might have an indirect effect. There are also indications that the virus can directly damage the kidneys in some cases, though that's apparently more rare. But for the majority of patients, especially patients with milder cases, the disease begins and ends in the lungs.
Derek Williams there. Keep the questions for him coming on our YouTube channel, via Facebook or Twitter. And that was our COVID-19 special. For more on the pandemic, do check out our social media channels and our website. That's dw.com, which has dedicated COVID-19 pages in 30 languages. I'm Gerhard Elpers in Berlin. There's a news update in half an hour. This is DW News. Stay tuned.